Hi, good evening. My name is Bala, and first of all, sorry for running 30 minutes late on all our sessions. Thanks for being patient with us. And we'll try to do our best to keep this interesting because I know that there is a nice cocktail reception waiting for you, all of you there. Prithpal and I, we're going to kind of walk you through some of the product functionality and capability, which is going to be really interesting for you when you think about the scale of APIs you need to deliver for your companies. So let's start with the fundamental premise which got us started thinking about these things. So today, what happens in a lot of enterprises we talk to, there's this constant tension between what they are trying to do with APIs and how fast they're trying to move with the developers. And at the same time, they have still some regulatory and compliance burdens on them. And they're not only compliance and regulatory burdens, they just have overall security concerns. And they need to kind of manage that. So there's a constant tussle between how can we move fast and how do APIs help us get there, versus how do we really make sure that we have the right checks and balances so that we don't do something for which we then regret exposing all these things via APIs or having a great partner program or other things. So today, our goal in the session is going to be giving you some tools, some guidance, and thinking about this in a way which is compatible with what you're trying to do, which is to really open up the APIs for your internal developers or external developers, go as fast as you can, and get the agility you need within your organization without having to compromise some of the security concerns that you might have. I kind of alluded to this in the previous session I was doing, which is the one thing we do want to reinvent and reimagine is how we think about governance, right? And the reason we want to do that is in this kind of digital age, you don't want an old methodology for governance. You want something that helps you keep things secure. You should be able to get alerted on things which you deem to be insecure. But at the same time, you want to make sure that the developer has the highest productivity possible, because I'm sure most of you have awesome developers and they are trying to do their best work and you don't want to get in their way. And part of that is why you have an API program, because you want them to be self-serving these APIs, using the APIs, and building something interesting for you and the business. So when we think about that, we go back to the basics or the foundational element of how we think about the product itself. And sorry if it's a repeat for folks who have seen this before, but it all starts in our mind with the digital value chain. So where we really focus on what are we delivering for the developers in two phases. One, it's an API for the developer who's building an application. Or on the other side, it's the developer or the development team that's producing the APIs. And we got to make sure that those two constituents are really, really happy with the end result. So what we have here in this value chain is to really make sure that the balance is between those two teams or those two constituents. But more importantly, the contract between those two is just via an API. And the reason I use the word contract again is that it has to be very clear to the developer who's consuming the API what they're getting and how the API will behave when they're building the application. And if you can't maintain that contract, then you lose the trust and you also create a ton of issues for that application and the end user who's eventually going to use the application. So in this case, for us, the security and how you implement the security is part of the contract. So if you don't think about that as part of the contract, what you can't do is deliver an API and suddenly go and change it because you suddenly have a new security implementation or need and decide to change the experience for the developer and ultimately impacts the end user who's using the application. So when you are building this API and when you're publishing this API, you have to think about security as part of the contract and what else you think is part of the contract. For the API producing team, I think this is again in terms of making sure that while you create the API, which is very easy to use, you have the right tooling built in so that you can monitor, you can analyze, and you can do the right things without affecting the developer or surprising the developer. So that's kind of the other aspect of how we want to think about this. Now, as you're building applications, what your really end goal is to really make sure that we're building awesome experiences for the customers. You want to make sure that the developer is able to build the applications faster and iterate faster. The developer who's using the API needs to be onboarded in an easy fashion. So when you think about onboarding, it is also about making sure that onboarding happens in a secure way. So for example, in the developer portal, you could say, come and test and play with this API, and you don't need a key, but you're going to be rate limited. You're going to have a sandbox environment with mock data, so you go at it, no problem. But when it comes to actual production APIs, then you may want to do things differently, and you may implement a set of different policies, which are to protect your backend, make sure that the application does a great experience for the customer, and it's very performant. The API itself is a gateway to your backend system, so it does need protection. And while you're doing that, you also want to make sure that there's consistent way to protect the APIs so that each developer who's producing the API from the API team is not figuring it out themselves. So part of today's session is going to be how do we let you have a consistent way to reuse some of these kind of security policies, and that's what we're going to do. On the other side, you do want the automation available to your API teams to again use our APIs for the product itself, to do what you need to do in terms of building new versions of APIs, or releasing new versions of APIs, or implementing security policies on the APIs, again, at scale. And the goal here is not to do it one by one. If you have a large set of APIs, we should give you the automation to do that. And of course, your backend systems are, again, I'm sure, protected by themselves, but this is one more layer of security that we can offer you. Now, as we think through all the security implications and reusability today, one of the things we want to do is really think about it from a holistic API lifecycle perspective. So we talk about this a lot with our customers because it's not about just exposing the API or consuming the API. It is really thinking about this in a much more holistic fashion, and it all starts with the API design itself. So as some of you might have heard from Marsh in the previous session, we are a big supporter, and we're part of the open API spec community, and we really want to contribute to making sure that's the best open standard for designing and creating APIs. So it starts with the design aspect, and we allow you to then do interesting things in our product to create the right kind of API endpoints, and then make sure that there's enough security around it, and then publish it. So at this point, what you've done is you've taken a very well-designed API and then constructed the right security policies and the right experience, and then publishing it out. And what does publishing it out mean? Publishing means it'll go to the developer portal or some place where the consumers of these APIs can come and read and engage with you and consume those APIs. Now, while they do that, there's other aspects of things which you need to start thinking about, which is that how do I scale the experience for those APIs? Sometimes this could be things like you have a store location API. And we've seen this in terms of store location, content, and things like that, where our product is able to actually cache and respond to the API request faster without you having to go re-platform or re-architect what you have in the backend and scale that. So there are certain use cases we won't be able to cache, but most of the times we are able to do that kind of work, allowing you to scale the API consumption without having to go and touch an old legacy system and try to scale that at this point in time. Or look at monitoring these API usage and then decide what do you want to do in terms of behavior change or performance change, or even think about systems which are not being used that much and then make the right decisions for that. That comes with the monitoring aspect and the analytic aspect. So monitoring also gives you things like, is my API up? Is there any latency that's increasing suddenly? How do I think about that and go and solve for that? Last but not the least, in some cases, you may want to go and monetize the APIs because it's the right way to kind of build an extra channel or distribution model. And when you do that, you're trying and creating a new way to open up your services to different set of customers who were not engaging with you previously, or you're engaging with a set of customers who actually are doing it today, but probably not in the most efficient fashion. So we have customers today, for example, they go on a one-on-one integration with certain partners, right? And it is almost hand-coded, very specific integrations that take months to deliver, And anytime you change something on your side in terms of the API, they go and do that all over again. The idea is to keep the business relationship as such, but try and improve the speed at which you can innovate and improve the experience for that partner and their customers for the services they offer from your side. So this whole life cycle is extremely important when it comes to thinking about the security and the policies and reusability, because it's not a one-time exercise. So you want to think about this at every stage, and part of our session today is going to be thinking through some of these aspects and walking through a real example. Okay? So let's look at the 3 things we will cover today. And again, we are not going to go through each one of these examples, but I wanted to kind of lay it out for you so that you at least can have a sense in terms of what we're trying to do when we talk about reusability and consistency. We talked a lot about security, and we do have a ton of features and benefits for you in the product for security, right? Starting with API keys, OAuth, we just announced SAML integration for authentication. We'll have role-based access control for a lot of things in our product. We have a set of very specific policies for threat protection, and then we also have something for bot detection and prevention. All these security features are available to you, and you can decide how you want to apply them depending on the use cases you have and when you want to do it for certain APIs and who the consumers are. The second thing is about visibility, because people, once they start using APIs, as an API team, what you want to do is look at who's using my APIs, how often they're using it, what are the typical patterns of usage, is there something else I should be doing in the API to make life easier for those customers? That's something you want to do. But along with that, you're also doing something operationally, looking at things like, if things are going not well, looking at the logs, looking at analytics, and looking at things like, where are the calls originating from? Do I have the right kind of, what is the distribution between the clients? Is it iOS, Android? All those kind of things you can actually infer from the analytics itself. And last but not the least, which is again important from a security point of view sometimes, and a compliance is, who had the access and what changes happened? Right? That kind of auditing capability is again available to you in the product. All these things give you the right level of visibility and right level of controls for what you want to do. Then comes the reusability and enforcement. And this is something, again, we introduced as a product feature about 30 to 45 days back. And the goal here is to really give you a set of tools to take all the stuff we already have in terms of policies and the code capability we have in the product, but package them as reusable things for your developers. Why is this important? A lot of your developers are just too busy. They're doing things, and they don't have the time or patience to learn one more tool. So the more you make it easy for them to consume something from Apigee, it becomes easier in their workflow, and they can go and do it. Number 2, consistency. And the reason you want to be consistent about this is primarily the developer experience who's consuming the API doesn't think that you have 10 developer teams within your organization, and each one is producing something which is very different in terms of an API experience. And they look at it and go, you're one company, how come you're delivering these APIs as if you're 10 different companies, right? That's the other challenge. The last one is enforcement, right? In certain cases, sheer security needs are that you want to enforce something and you don't want to give a choice. And that could be because you have sensitive data, you could have sensitive business needs, and there, it's not a choice for the developer, it just gets enforced, right? Again, it still adds to the consistency, but in this case, it's more of a need for you from a business point of view that you want this to be enforced. So when you think about in those three aspects, the reusability and enforcement becomes very, very important. But going back to my starting premise, which is you do this with the developer productivity in mind. This cannot be a blocker. This cannot slow the way you roll things out in terms of your APIs, or it cannot create a friction when it comes to somebody consuming your APIs. So you really are looking at delivering this reusability and enforcement in a fashion which really does little to slow things down from your side. Now, you've heard me repeatedly talk about speed, reusability, speed, developer productivity. Why is this important? The classic example today is that when somebody needs an API, let's say somebody wants to take a payment API. A developer wants to take a payment API, use it in their application. The starting point is they just do a Google search. They look at some APIs. They go read up the documentation. If that doesn't appeal to them and they can't make sense of the documentation and then the usage of that API fast enough, they're going to move to something else. That's one way to do it. The other one is they're going to look at the community wherever they are, right? Whether they are hanging around in Stack Overflow or they go to an event like this, they're going to talk to people. And guess what? They're going to ask them, hey, what payment API you guys use in your e-commerce site? Somebody's going to say, I use this. Why? It's easy to use. It took me 10 minutes to integrate that into my workflow, or 1 day, and we're done. That is what the developers are looking for. Now, when you produce an API for whatever the business you are in, you're going to have the same level of scrutiny no matter what. Now, it may not be half an hour, it may not be a 10-minute benchmark, because you may be in a much more complex business. But the speed at which the developers who are consuming your API is important. And for you to get there and improve their experience, you're going to learn, fine-tune your API, improve your API constantly. And if you're not learning and improving your API, you're going to lose that developer who's going to consume your API. So hence the need for you to have the speed at which you can learn and improve your API. So this is not about blind speed. It's not about you trying to race somebody. It is just the fact that as you learn, as you improve your API, you're going to have a much better experience for the developer who's going to consume it. And that's the reason why you want that speed in your development cycle. So that's why I keep going back to developer productivity on both sides, your own developers and the developers who are going to consume it, and the reusability. So with that context, what I'm going to do is invite Prithpal up on stage, who's going to actually walk you through very specifically what we do in the product to help facilitate all these three things, right? In terms of security, in terms of visibility, and in terms of reusability and enforcement. Okay? Please welcome Prithpal.
Thank you, Bala. All right, so Bala has been touching on a few key things, and I'm going to just try and take it to the next level. So we've been talking about the digital value chain. We spoke about the API lifecycle, right? And he also touched on something very important, which is the API contract, right? That's kind of the common place where API providers or the producing team of APIs communicate the intent of what they want to do, and on the other side of it, the consumers of the APIs, aka developers who are building apps, can understand a common language. So I'm going to cover 3 key themes, and we'll actually get into a live demo mode. So you'll see me talking about some concepts, lay some groundwork, get into a demo. And so I'm going to cover consistency first, then we'll talk about reusability, and lastly, we'll go address the enforcement pieces. So let's talk a little bit about consistency. I think, to me, one of the key things which comes up in my conversations with customers is we just want a common language, a common vocabulary where the API provider team, that is the team who's building APIs, can do it in a very consistent way, right? So that the consumer side of it, which is the app developers, can consume that in a way that makes sense to them, and more importantly, adopt those APIs. Bala also mentioned the word Open API. So Open API is one of those common standards which have really taken a lot of traction in the industry. It used to be previously known as Swagger. So many of our customers today, when they start to think about what an API should be, they leverage the Open API spec to do that. And there are a dozen tools available out there for you to author your Open API specs. But one of the key advantages of the Open API spec in general is the ability for it to be language agnostic. So that's one way for you to describe the intent of what your API is, what kind of operations are going to be supported on the API, and more importantly, what kind of capabilities of the APIs are going to be supported. It's very easy to understand. There's huge adoption. As Bala also mentioned, not only are we supporting Open API for some time, we are a very active contributing member of that specification. So you'll continue to see that. In this segment here, I'm going to show you a little bit about the Apigee Edge product and specific pieces of how, for the API provider, you can use the integrated Open API editor to collaborate and build APIs. Okay? Let's switch over to the demo, please. Excellent. So what you're seeing out here right now is the Apigee Edge user interface. In fact, this is the new Apigee Edge experience, and this is something which we have released in the last few months. One of the key themes of this user experience is making it very intuitive for the API provider. So in this case, I happen to be logged into Apigee Edge. Apigee, as you know, from a product perspective, is available in the cloud and also on premises. I'm logged onto the cloud product. On the top left, you can see the org, which is organization for short, which is available out here. And that's the one that I'm connected to. Now, what I'm going to do is just play along with the theme of consistency. And we'll take a look at how it makes it super easy for an API provider to build consistent API proxies using an open API spec. Okay? So I'm just going to hover over here. So this is an example of a very simple open API spec. This is the starting point of how someone starts to describe what an API should be. Okay? So I'm just going to use this as a source. So I'm logged into my Apigee Edge instance. One of the very first things I want to do is click on the specs icon. And what this does is it brings me to a screen where I, as an API provider, can now start putting some very, very initial pieces into the story out here. So let's say I'm going to call this a commerce folder because I want to build a very simple products API. Okay? So note I just kind of created a very simple folder here. Let's go into it. And let's go build a new spec. So I can just go out here and start creating a very simple spec, in which case you can see it has an integrated OpenAPI editor. I can start making changes out here. And as I'm making changes, you can see some live updates happening on the right-hand side. Okay? So this is the genesis of a very, very simple API. Take it a step forward and try and build something a little bit more elaborate. Let's go actually import an existing API spec. So we'll call this thing the product API. And I had just shown a URL a few minutes back. Let's go ahead and click and import. Within a couple clicks, I'm now able to actually pull together the entire API spec. And this API spec, as you can imagine, would have been built off by different API developers. You could have one team who could have started doing this thing earlier, then pass it along to another team. In this case, once you import this API spec into Apigee Edge, there is an asset repository which will store all the API specs in there. So you think about collaboration once you have imported an API spec and you want to now collaborate on this with rest of your developer teams, you can easily do that. You can see one of the key elements of this editor is to ensure that you have some clean API documentation, which many customers are accustomed to using gets surfaced. So in this case, it's pretty clear that the intent is to be able to get a specific product out of the product collection. This is one of the key things which Bala had touched on. This is very important. If your APIs are not easy, if they aren't consistent and simple to use, chances are your developers are going to move to another one very, very quickly, right? I'll give you a very simple analogy. If you were to flip out your cell phone and take a look at an app, and if the app takes more than 3 or 4 seconds to load, that describes the user experience, and I can guarantee many folks are going to be searching at the App Store for a newer app. Believe it or not, a very similar experience is happening in the industry today. Bala spoke about some payment providers. PayEasy, Stripe, there are dime a dozen payment providers. If you do not cut the friction and make your APIs simple and easy to use, the app developers are going to another provider very, very quickly, right? This is very important. So you can see, given the tools and making all those capabilities available within the product, it makes it very simple for the API developer to start working with this. It doesn't really end here. The key proposition from here and the feature which is core to Apigee is, great, I now have an API spec. How do I take it from the design phase to the develop phase? Just using that button, I'm able to actually click and generate an API proxy. An API proxy is nothing but think of that as a message flow, where you can add a bunch of different policies. So you may have some APIs in the backend, which is mentioned out here. You see the existing API URL. That is nothing but the existing API. That's your backend API. It could be a product API. It could be an order API. Using this tooling, I'm able to create an API proxy in which you can add certain interesting policies. So let's say you have an order API, but it's not secure. I can create an API proxy which becomes like a facade. Think of that as a facade. And I can just add a security policy. And just by using configuration-oriented constructs, guess what happens? Your API suddenly is now secure using OAuth. I can also add things such as transformation, etc. So you get the point. You may have 1 or 2 or 3 APIs that you expose on this side to your consumers, but you can manage all the inconsistencies that you may have today by using some clean, consistent standards. Okay? So I can take this a step forward, click on Next, Next, add certain choices here, deploy it. And at this point in time, in less than 3 minutes, I've taken an API spec and generated an API proxy, right? This proxy is deployed in the test environment. I can try it. I can use it. Think about the life cycle and how collaboration could be achieved using some of the tools that Apigee provides. OK, so let's switch back to the slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about reusability, because this is a very, very important aspect. And one of the key things which Bala touched on early on is it's not only just a few ad hoc API developers building APIs, although many teams start that way. We have big enterprise customers who have hundreds of API developers across different business organizations, different teams. When you're talking about doing things at scale, every single action, every single configuration counts. Right? We have customers who have well over hundreds of thousands of APIs in some instances. Some have internal APIs. Some have external APIs, which are exposed to the outside world. So where does reusability kick in? Some of the common things we see our customers do is, I may have a very specific way of solving a specific utility function within the enterprise. Using Apigee Edge, you can create that as a policy which can be reused across the entire enterprise. Okay? It saves every API developer that valuable time in trying to do what they need to. One of the areas that I'm going to touch on in this demo segment is a feature called shared flows. So shared flows is something which we have released in the last 40 days or so. It gives the ability for API developers to be able to share some useful interaction or design patterns that they have already solved. They can be reused across many other developers for building APIs. So in this example, I'm going to, in the backdrop, talk about we have many customers who are integrating, and I'm sure many of you guys out here have very similar needs. Let's say there's an example of someone trying to integrate with Salesforce APIs. Okay? Could be any other cloud API provider, for that matter of fact. There are some very simple yet important steps that you have to do to get access to the Salesforce APIs. And the 3 things are, you need to have a user ID, an account out there. You need to call a token endpoint to get some OAuth token. And once you have that, then you can make call to the account API, the case, the opportunity, so on and so forth. Right? Think about, for a second, that you and some of the other developers are tasked with building out some integration internally with some of those Salesforce APIs. Okay? There's a very common pattern that you have to use across all the interactions. So let's take a look at how, using the shared flow feature, you can provide those kind of mechanics of reusability within the enterprise. Let's switch to the demo, please. All right. So short of using the Salesforce APIs, in this case, I'm actually going to use the API from one of the Apigee components called the API BaaS, or backend as a service. API BaaS is a component of the Apigee stack which gives you the ability to have data collection. So you can very quickly, on the fly, create a data collection, right? So you can say, here's an employee's data collection. I can add some records to it. It is native JSON based. And without doing anything, you have an API endpoint to that. So very useful for if you want to rapidly just prototype something. In some cases, customers are using this to support their catalogs, some cases preferences, so on and so forth. So I'm going to use that as a backdrop for this API, okay? As I mentioned, it exposes an API endpoint. So let's take a look at, just keep your watch out on this URL out here. I'll expand this a little bit. So that's the stage. So you can see the URL endpoint on the top right. Now this endpoint and the employees collection that you can see, I'm from the LA area, so you can see a slight Hollywood preference that I have out here with the employees in my employees collection. So what I'm going to do out here is, let's quickly try to call this the employees collection. You can see it's an API endpoint. So again, I'm just picking up this as a backdrop for my example. This could be the Salesforce API and any other cloud provider API for that matter of fact. So when I call this, you can see that this is sitting in an area which doesn't have access super easy, right? You need to be able to have some credentials to get access to it. If I was to try the sandbox version of it, which is exactly the same except it's in sandbox, you can see that I'm getting the data collection back from there. Okay, fair enough? So the sandbox area gives me access to that. It's just freewheeling access. I can just call the API many times. But the staging area is actually a higher environment, and you want to be able to have the right credentials. So let's take a quick peek at how you could go about using the tooling to build API proxies and reuse some of those policies. So let me go back to the API proxy tab. And the API proxy tab is where, as you would expect, you can see different kinds of API proxies you've built. So I'm going to bring up the employees API proxy. This is something which I whipped up very quickly. You can see that I have some overview information on the screen out here. It can tell you where it is deployed. It shows you the same backend URL, which I just queried for you guys live. So this API proxy is now actually going to make a call to this backend API that I just called, right? And you can add a lot of different kinds of policies to make the API magic work. So I'm on a certain revision of this API. And what I'm going to do out here is, I'll click on the Develop tab.
The microphone was literally in my mouth.
And I'll show you revision 1 here. All right, so I'll call out certain things. What you're really seeing out here is the anatomy of an API proxy. This is how an API proxy looks like. So I happen to be in the API proxy editor view. And in this case, you can see that I have some caching policies, which I've used. We actually happen to have 30 out-of-the-box policies to do a variety of different kinds of things. So you can do traffic management, you can do security, which I'll cover in the next piece. Right? You can do threat protection, you can do mediation, and more importantly, the platform is extensible, which means you can author your own policies. So in this case, in the employees API proxy, I had 3 things that I'm doing. I have to make a call to a token endpoint on my API BAS instance, passing in certain credentials. Okay? Once I get that, it's going to return to me an access token. Right? So I make a call with some credentials. I get an access token, because we are trying to access the stage environment, which requires some authorization before I can access any data set. And then that header needs to be set. So just imagine this for a second. These 3 activities have to be done no matter whether I'm trying to access the employees collection, or an activities collection, or a hotels data set, or whatever data set that you created out there. So in this case, we go to this thing called a shared flow. So in the shared flow, in this area, you can go create shared flows. And shared flows are nothing but a very simple construct. Think of that as an API proxy at some level, but it's kind of a flow which can contain policies which can be referenced by multiple API proxies. Right? So just play along with me for a few seconds. become very clear. So in this case, I know that I need to access those 3 policies we just discussed. Make a call to API BAS, token endpoint, get the OAuth token, and set it in the header, whether I'm trying to call the employees collection or any other collection. So let's go into this shared flow. And in this shared flow, if I click on the Develop tab, you can see that I've copied the exact same 3 policies in here. Okay? I just showed you revision 1 of the API proxy, and I'm just saying, all right, let me now move them into a shared flow, because I know once I'm solving this for my employees API proxy, this functionality is going to be needed by developers across many other backend collections, and we can solve this once and reuse that across many implementations. So I have a shared flow, and it's deployed both to the test and the prod environment.
More good news.
Okay? All right. Going back to the API proxies, I now have the employees API proxy,
Show flow is not changed.
and I'll switch to revision 3, which is out here. And in the Develop tab now, you can see that I access that using something called as a flow callout. Okay? So in this case, all I have done is I've shown you the shared flow with those 3 policies, and in this case, I'm just making a call to that. So think about all the other developers who are going to be now needing access to either the employees collection or any other data collection that you build out there, can just reuse the exact same flow across all the APIs. Okay, let's try and test this thing.
Is that a copy, Jim?
One of the interesting things, and I'm sure you're going to see this thing in some other sessions as well, is the ability to look at what's going on when an API proxy is being tested out. It's very useful for some of customers and developers who are actually building APIs and want to be able to quickly test out some of these things. You come and put the API proxy in a trace mode, and now I'm going to call not this endpoint, but the employees endpoint out here. This is a new API endpoint which is enabled by the API proxy. Okay? So let's call this, and you can see that I get the data back from the collection. Right? So we did a few things. I showed you what our shared flow is. I showed you what kind of policies you can attach out there. Then I also showed you how that shared flow can be invoked from one or multiple API proxies. So it's a great way for you to be able to distribute some of the common things that you're doing across some back-end third-party systems, and then leverage that in your development initiatives. Okay? Awesome. So now, let's take it to the next level. Can we switch to the slides, please? So Bala spoke about one very key thing. As you start to scale out your API program, as you have not 1, 10, but hundreds and more APIs, it becomes very important to have some very, very horizontal, cross-cutting policies enforced. Right? So what do I mean by that? It's very important to leverage your API platform to be agile, so you can really roll out APIs very rapidly. That's important. That's what an API developer or an API provider is tasked with. They just want to roll out APIs very quickly. However, from a security and a compliance perspective, those teams want to ensure that when APIs make it into production, they are secure, right? They cannot afford to delegate the responsibility and assume and trust that the developer is going to do that. With all good intentions, developers will try and do what they need to, but there are common requirements such as, I need to have consistent security across all my APIs. That's something that the security and the compliance team needs to have the ability at their level to enforce it. Okay? The other thing is logging. Let's say there's a requirement from an audit perspective, and many of our customers do. In fact, many of my customers that we talk to say, because APIs are the face to the world digitally, and they are now enabling many interactions through APIs, that means every single interaction which happens on that channel has to be recorded, has to be audited, has to be logged somewhere. And many of our customers use several different kinds of enterprise logging systems such as Splunk, Sumo, Loggly, and a few others. So those aspects become a very key part of ensuring that you have consistency in terms of security, consistency in terms of logging and auditing. And in this section, I'm going to show you one feature called the flow hooks. It's a great mechanism for all the administrators and the security and compliance folks who are leveraging the Apigee platform to be able to enforce that using a few clicks. Okay? So we'll talk about how flow hooks work and how you can use that feature to provide the same benefits in your enterprise as well. Can you switch to the demo, please? Okay, so we're back out here. Now, let's play this thing a little bit forward. So you saw a very simple employees API proxy, which gives you access to some backend data. I can do some caching, and I'm off building an app on top of it, right? Although this is okay for me to have an API like this in development, you can see that there is no API key, no API security that was needed to call this API, right? So if I'm a developer, and this is a public URL, you could try it right now, you can keep hitting this endpoint, and it will give you the API data, right? And although that's okay when you're developing and testing it, it's not okay when you go to production. The security team has a responsibility there. So they want to ensure that if it goes into production, at a minimum, that API is protected using an API key. Sure, they can have more exaggerated requirements where it needs to have an OAuth protection, I need to have some threat protection, some traffic management. So let's use the simple example of, let's try and protect this API, but the ops and the security team want to be very, very clear of to not delegating the responsibility and relying that the developer is going to do it. Because you have a bunch of developers who are off building their APIs, but production is the environment that they control. Okay? So let's show you how the flow hook feature kind of enables that. So as an example, I have this API proxy deployed in the prod environment as well. Okay? Let's just call this. I'm going to change the URL to now say demo5-prod. Okay? And let me try call this thing. Right away, you can see that I need an API key. Right? How did this happen? It's the exact same API proxy which the developer built and has deployed it. Right? But something changed in the production environment. Let's take a peek on how that happened. So if I go back to the employees API proxy, I still have those two things. Cache a response, return it from there if you can, or make those 3 policy calls to access the backend system. Here is where the magic starts. In this admin tab, when I click on environments, I have a few key things which show up here. I'll try and zoom in a little bit. The one that I really want to share out here is the flow hooks. So flow hooks is a very simple mechanism to say that I have 4 entry points. Okay? So think about an API proxy. As I mentioned, an API proxy is nothing but a facade, right? If you think of this as your right-hand side or my left-hand side, and think of this as being your employee's backend endpoint or your third-party APIs, on the right-hand side or to your left is the API consumer. In the middle is the API proxy, right? That's where any call which comes from here gets intercepted and gets passed on to the right-hand side. Okay? So there are 4 key touch points out there, or hooks, if you would. One is the pre-proxy, the pre-target, and the post-target, and the post-proxy. In a very simple way, what that means is do some checks on this side before I even go there, and do some checks on this side before you actually send it to the backend, right? So in this case, in the test environment, I do not have anything out here. That's why when I'm making a call to the employee API proxy in the test environment, it works flawlessly without any API key. But let's go switch this to the prod environment. Once I change the environment from test to prod, you can see that there's a common security shared flow which has been enabled at the pre-proxy flow hook. Okay? This is something which the security and the compliance team can easily affect. They can go in out here and put all kinds of things, all kinds of shared flow for at the different elements. So in this case, we use a common security shared flow. Let's go take a look at what that is. If I go back to the shared flow, in the common security shared flow, which is only deployed to the prod environment, and hence you could see that the API was protected by default without the developer having to do anything in the prod environment. And in this case, there is a verify API key policy in there, right? Which is expecting an API key in the request parameter. Okay? So just by simple clicks, we were able to kind of put in this power in the hands of the ops teams, the security and the compliance teams, to be able to ensure that APIs are protected. And you can expand this thing to saying, in this shared flow, or in some other ones, at different levels, you can actually have message logging policy. So message logging policy is an example of an out-of-the-box policy which can be used to log to any enterprise logging system, right? So now, in this case, let's switch back to the Postman client that I've been using, and I'll actually change the collection that I'm using, or the endpoint. I'm going to call the prod endpoint. But in this case, I'm going to actually supply an API key. Okay? So an API key, in this case, was generated through Apigee Edge, in which case we say, great, someone needs access to this API. You can go and generate an API key, which can be shared with your consumer. It serves dual purposes. Not only it provides a step of security so that the API can only be called when an API key gets passed in, right? But it also serves as an excellent identification mechanism, where if you're thinking about a bunch of partners or consumers who are calling your APIs, you then have a very great insight into who's actually the biggest adopter of APIs, something which product managers care very deeply about. If you're thinking of running your business using APIs, that kind of mechanics play a very important role in figuring out who's actually a big user of APIs. So in this case, I'm going to pass the API key, and you can see that in production, I can now start accessing the APIs as I was in development. Make sense? And if I go back to trying to call this API endpoint in production without an API key, it will consistently fail. Test, I can keep calling it multiple times. Oops. Change this to test. Okay? All right. So let's switch back to the slides. Great. So we took a look at 3 themes. We spoke about consistency. We spoke about how you can use the Open API editor to be able to have collaboration, have some consistency in how you define APIs. We looked at some features of the product in the area of reusability, right? Which was all about, I'm building up API at scale. I'm having some common capabilities and functionality that I want to share across my enterprise. The shared flow was a great mechanism to do that. And lastly, we spoke about enforcement, and you looked at how we could use flow hooks to be able to enforce some very common security, logging, and compliance requirements using configuration-oriented constructs. Okay? So I'm going to turn it over back to Bala at this point to take us to close.
Great. Thank you, Prasad. So hopefully the demo was very illustrative of the things we talked about in terms of when we think about security, reusability, and enforcement, and how do we achieve that in the product. And going back to the summary view here, the reason we care about this deeply is we want the API platform to be all about getting you adoption for your APIs. If you have great APIs and nobody's using them, it's kind of a waste. So we want to make sure that all your internal developers, external developers are able to take advantage of those APIs. You're able to scale and serve those developers very, very well and applications really well. And the last one is, of course, that you want to make sure that you still have a lot of control and security mechanisms around those APIs. All this, to reinforce the point, is helping you drive agility, right? Helping you deliver things at speed so they can learn, improve, and iterate over and over again. So with that context, to close out, what you've seen today and how it benefits your API program, if I have to kind of summarize that for you, it is essentially giving you agility at scale with security. So if you have one takeaway from the session, it will be, how do you have a speed of execution at scale for a lot of your APIs with the security needs that you need to comply with?